Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Julie Allen. It's the week of March 11th, and this is your Monday briefing. President Biden has released his fiscal year 2025 budget, and it includes proposed tax increases on corporations and high-income individuals. We will be issuing an insight on what you need to know about the president's budget. Last week, the SEC issued long-awaited rules for companies to disclose how the climate is likely to affect their operations. Since these rules were proposed, numerous differing opinions have been submitted to the SEC. There were over 24,000. So even getting to an agreement was tight. The vote was 3-2. Joining me to talk about exactly how big of a lift this is going to be for companies is Valerie Wieman, a partner in our national office. Val, welcome.
Thanks, Julie.
Val, could you start with the significance of these rules?
I can, and they are significant. They're about 2 years in the making, and they were definitely highly anticipated. The scope is pretty much as broad as the SEC could make it, with the rules applicable to most registrants, including domestic and foreign private issuers. Now, while there was some dramatic changes from the proposal, this is still going to be take a concerted effort from a compliance standpoint. It will be a bit of a heavy lift. I think maybe California stole some of their thunder in the laws that were passed last year, but this is still going to be a big step for the SEC's investor protection efforts. Climate risk can have a real financial implication, and I think the idea is to preview those risks for investors who are concerned about more than just short-term investing.
What type of disclosures will be required of companies, and when are they required?
So that's a lot to put into one question, Julie, but we think about it in three categories. There's climate-related risk, there's greenhouse gas or GHG emissions, and then there's the footnote disclosures. Now, the climate-related risks aren't that different than the proposal. You need to identify the risks that have materially impacted or are reasonably likely to have a material impact on the registrant, and that would include on their strategy, their results of operations, or their financial condition. Now, you also have related disclosures about how management and the board manage and oversee those risks, which aligns pretty closely if you're familiar with the provisions in the cybersecurity rules that were issued last year. Now, for greenhouse gases, Scope 3 is not required. That was actually a significant change from the proposal. That element was highly contested based on the impact, the effort it would take, and the impact that might have on private companies. Now, Scope 3 are the emissions in a company's value chain. Your large registrants, and by that I mean your large accelerated filers and your accelerated filers, they'll need to disclose your Scope 1, which are your direct emissions, and your Scope 2, which are your purchased emissions, if they're material. And there's also a phased-in assurance requirement on those emissions. Now, the timing was also relaxed in that there was some concern about the ability to include these disclosures in the company's Form 10K. But in the final rule, you are permitted to submit those disclosures, the emission disclosures, when you file your second quarter 10Q. Now, lastly, there is a footnote requirement, which is different than other frameworks. Most of the other frameworks don't touch the footnote disclosures, but the SEC is calling for disclosure if capitalized costs and charges and amounts expensed or losses related to severe weather events and other natural conditions. Now that's severe weather and not climate. If those amounts exceed 1% of stockholders' equity or pre-tax income. There is a de minimis floor that would address companies that may be in a break-even situation, so they're not disclosing really small amounts. Now, the timing is also phased, so large accelerated filers would need to include most of the disclosures in 2025, meaning in their 2025 10Ks filed in 2026. And then the emission disclosures would follow the next year in 2026. Now, assurance would start in 2029 for that group of registrants with limited assurance. That's basically a review of the disclosures, of the emissions disclosures, and it wouldn't be until 2033 when they would require an audit of those emission disclosures. Accelerated filers is your next tranche of registrants. They would be required to have most of their disclosures in 26, and then their emission disclosures wouldn't be until 2028. And then their limited assurance would begin in 2031. But this group actually, there's no current plan for them to actually progress to an audit of those emissions.
So Val, since the guidance was issued last week, have you heard of any questions or comments from companies?
We're getting a number of very high-level questions. I think one of the more significant changes from the proposal is the more pervasive consideration of materiality. And I think this has garnered a lot of discussion in the context of emissions, which, as I mentioned, are now only required if they are material. Now, the idea of assessing sustainability from a materiality perspective isn't new. Companies who are complying with the European standards would be familiar with it. But the emissions are only required if they're material, and that's a little different way of looking at it than companies who are more used to a financial materiality perspective. Now, there are other elements that are only required if they are related to a material risk. So again, materiality will come into play, like scenario analysis or climate-related targets. But otherwise, we're really only 5 days into having the new rules, so the questions are fairly high level at this point, but I do expect companies to quickly get a lot more granular.
And Val, how do these rules align and interact with other international and domestic climate-related reporting requirements?
I'll say that is one of the high-level questions that we are getting on what's referred to as interoperability. So the SEC rules are based on the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures recommendations, that's the TCFD, and that's the same basis for the International Sustainability Standards Board Sustainability Reporting Standards, as well as the European Sustainability Reporting Standards under the CSRD. There's also a California law that now requires a TCFD report. So there are foundational commonalities in the 4 pillars of the TCFD framework, and that includes governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. So preparing for one framework, the assessment of climate risk, the reporting of emissions, the details about management and board oversight, those should be able to be used in multiple places. But for the most part, we don't yet have true interoperability, meaning that while you can leverage the data and the information, you generally can't submit a report prepared for one framework to satisfy the requirements of another. Now, the adopting release from the SEC did address this specifically, saying that they'll continue to watch how frameworks are adopted. And maybe I'll mention that California is the one exception. Senate Bill 261, that's the California law that requires TCFD reporting. They specifically identify the ISSB sustainability disclosure standards as being comparable.
And what types of operational and information gathering changes could companies consider adopting to comply with these rules?
I think the model is going to be very much the same for any of the frameworks that I've mentioned, whether it be California or the CSRD or the ISSB. The important first step is to start with a really good understanding of the requirements, an assessment of what the company has already disclosed, and then the data that's currently available. And once you have those two things, you really need to develop a detailed process to fill any of those gaps. So basically a gap analysis. And we can't say enough that this is going to need a cross-functional team. You're going to need the involvement of financial reporting, investor relations, legal, internal audit, as well as your sustainability experts, all working together to really come up with the most effective and efficient way to comply, with obviously frequent communication with the board, given their new responsibilities relative to disclosing their oversight.
Val, this is very helpful. Your detail on going over the rules, the complexity and the timing, I think has been very helpful. So thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Julie.
Now, last week, we held the 7th Annual International Tax Conference and filmed a series of interviews on tax strategy, international tax guidance, Pillar 2, and much more. The episodes can be found on the Policy on Demand website, and some are included in the email with this episode. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Take care.